This program is made possible in part by the National Endowment for the Arts and the Rouse Company Foundation.
Hello, welcome to The Writing Life. My name is Terence Winch, and it's my pleasure today to introduce you to novelist and short story writer Colum McCann. Colum McCann, born in Dublin in 1965, is on everyone's literary A-list these days, with a highly acclaimed novel called Songdogs and a short story collection called Fishing the Slow Black River under his belt. He has just published a new novel called This Side of Brightness. This Side of Brightness, set in the past and present and focusing on New York subway tunnels and the sand hogs who built them, could, I guess, be called something of an underground sensation. Publishers Weekly, in an issue a week or two ago, in a starred review, said, "It's always a joy when a second novel lives up to the promise of an author's debut, but this outstanding follow-up to Songdogs is a triumph." Colum lives in New York, and the landscape of his fiction is as likely to be New York or Mexico or the Irish countryside. He escapes the narrow stereotype of the Irish literary figure, instead striding onto the world stage with the virtuosity and vision that we can all be thankful for. So welcome.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
And I'll start off by asking you how you would define yourself in terms of the literary universe or the landscape today, especially vis-a-vis your identity as an Irish writer who doesn't necessarily write about Irish subject matter.
Well, I'm very much an Irish writer. I think I realized I'm an Irish writer when I read an interview with Brian Moore, the novelist, and he said that he realized finally that he was an Irish writer, even though he's lived in got a Canadian citizenship and so on. When he knew that he wanted to be buried back home in Ireland, he knew that he could never lose the thump of Irishness to him, and I think I agree with that. And I think there's a movement amongst young Irish people. They become much more international. They're like the international mongrels. They can fit in a number of different places and with joy. And I've traveled. I've been lucky enough to have traveled a fair amount, to have lived in the United States and to have lived in the Far East, and also to have grown up in Ireland. But ultimately, I don't think you can take someone's original geography away from them. And so I live in New York, which is the city of exiles, so I'm comfortable there.
I in some ways, I sort of see you as an example of the new Ireland, for want of a better term. I mean, in Ireland especially in the last 10 years or so, has kind of jumped from the 19th century into the 21st in one leap. And a lot of young Irish people today seem to be very cosmopolitan, very sophisticated characters altogether. And
well, the interesting thing, if you think about the Irish who came to America even 50 years ago, when you left the shores, say if you left from Mayo, they would have a wake for you, what's called an American wake. And so you would be at your own funeral, really, because they knew you weren't coming back.
That's right.
But now you have a commuter generation, people who are able to come back from New York to Dublin, from London to Kilchima in Mayo. It's almost as if you live in Cork and you want to get to Dublin, it's as quick from London. And so you have this internationalism, and of course Dublin and Ireland itself has become quite cosmopolitan and vibrant with its art and so on. There's a new freshness and confidence, and sometimes a new arrogance, because not everything always has its good side, does it? But I think the younger Irish are flourishing in a lot of ways. And I don't think anybody can speak for any particular generation, so I don't see myself, as I say, a spokesperson for, say, the new Irish or anything like that. It's just that I happen to write about people who live in lots of different situations. Like I have a Mexican mother in one of my novels, Songdogs, and my new novel is a lot of African-American characters in it, and so on. And I feel comfortable in lots of different places.
Yeah, that's interesting you raised that. As I was reading through your work over the last few weeks, I kept thinking about you know, Cormac McCarthy and Richard Price and Sherwood Anderson even, and mostly American possible sources or inspirations for some of what you do. And rarely, you know, was I thinking, you know, James Joyce or John McGahern or Irish writers. And that seems to me to be a really interesting and unique feature about your work and maybe about your own sort of aesthetic perspective and personality.
Well, I find it interesting. I grew up in a sort of middle-class Dublin family, which was absolutely non-traumatic or anything like that. My father, who's also written, was home every day, and a lot of people say
What
that
did he write?
He was a journalist, and he also wrote 27 different books. He now writes about roses, but he wrote about Brendan Behan, Sean O'Casey, books about the Irish theatre, the Fighting Irish. And what happened to me was that he would come to the States and he'd bring back, he'd do lecture tours about writing sometimes in the States. And he would come back and he'd have books tucked under his arm, Kerouac, Ferlinghetti, Ginsberg, Burroughs. He says, here, go and have a look at that. And at
Were
the time,
you the only one reading that stuff in Ireland then?
well, amongst my friends,
Really?
certainly,
Yeah.
I was. At the time, we were studying Joyce and Beckett and Shaw in school, and I didn't realize until my 20s that you know, my primary education in literature was Dylan Thomas and the beat writers of America in my teens. It wasn't until my 20s that I rediscovered Irish literature. So I think
that's interesting because the influence of American pop culture is so ubiquitous and you know, pervasive everywhere, including Ireland.
That's right.
That I think a lot of people over here would make the assumption that American writing would have a similar kind of dominance in a lot of ways, but that stuff wasn't quite so common.
No, it wasn't quite so common, and also it had sort of crested itself in the 60s and early 70s, and for me it was sort of a discovery, and who knows, there may have been hundreds of people around Ireland reading the same sort of stuff, but I think most people were grounded more in Irish and European literature, and so I had this myth of America, this myth of the America with the K, the Kerouac K,
right.
And so I came over when I was 21 years old and took a bicycle across the United States for 2 years, and started in Massachusetts, went all the way down to Florida, across to Texas, down to Mexico, up to Canada, eventually finished in San Francisco, and really became a storyteller then, because, as I was saying, I didn't really have any huge trauma to create the artist in me. Like a lot of writers have difficulties in their lives, young. And I think there's two types of artists, those who are traumatized into art and those who work their way and shape themselves into art. And I was definitely of the second category.
Were you writing during that whole time you were traveling?
I was a journalist. Yeah.
So you were taking a lot of notes?
I was taking notes, but mostly what I was doing was listening to people. Met all these fabulous people all over the country, like Native Americans, people living in absolute poverty in Louisiana, very wealthy people in Texas. I dug ditches in Idaho to fight fires, and I was a bicycle mechanic for a while. And my experience was a scattered experience. I just took off on the bicycle and slept out at night, unless I was invited into someone's house, and I often was. And one of the amazing things is, for me, is I found the States to be this incredibly friendly place. Now, Ireland has that as well, and Ireland certainly has that reputation, but I don't think America has had that reputation.
I know.
And I go home to Ireland each year, and I always take a walk. I walk from Belfast to Cork, or from Dublin to Galway, or I try to do a walk every year. And I found the Americans, particularly in rural areas, were so open, much more open than people in Ireland.
Yeah, I agree with you, basically. That's been my experience quite often. I mean, there's exceptions everywhere, but I think you're right to focus on that. Well, what are your writing habits like today?
Well,
obviously, you have a family now, and you're not riding bikes around the country. And
yeah, I have a 1-year-old daughter, and we live in New York. And of course, everything changes. I mean, we did travel an awful lot, but now I'm more content to travel in the imagination as much as anything else, because that's where I believe there's a great freedom, and I don't think that I have to live a certain type of life, a life of a writer. I mean, people talk about the pram in the hallway being the death of art, and I think that's ridiculous. I think it's absolutely ridiculous. I love the joy of being a father, and discovering new things. And while I was in New York, I decided to go down to these tunnels to meet the homeless people who live in the subway tunnels, to work on the new novel.
Well, before we get to that, and speaking of the imagination, I would love to hear you read something from Songdogs. There's a passage in there. One of the main characters is a photographer, and you create this really wonderful device of walking inside some of his photographs to recreate some of the past that the young protagonist of the book is examining.
That's right.
And there's one passage where he's looking at a photo that his father took on a Bronx street in the 50s, I think.
That's right.
And I thought it was really evocative. I'm from the Bronx myself, as you know, and I thought it really, it was right on the money and really beautifully done. So if you could read.
Sure, I'd be delighted to. Connor, the narrator, is reimagining his parents' lives, and so he actually walks physically into these, or metaphysically into these photographs. The first of them is a street, a Bronx tenement street, hermetically sealed at the end of the 50s. The street loops itself into a red brick cul-de-sac. At the end of the road, there's a commotion. It's a summer's day, and boys are wearing bathing togs and running back and forth through a geyser of water erupting from a broken fire hydrant. Their hair is very short, their bodies scrawny and white. One teenager, with a few tufts of hair in bloom on his chest, is in the middle of a huge leap through the water. Arms held out wide, his fingers spread, a roar on his lips, eyebrows arched, rack of ribs exposed. The girls aren't allowed to put on bathing suits. This is a Catholic street, but some of them run their way through the water anyway, in long dresses which cling to their thighs. Along the side of the street, a football is in mid-motion, heading towards a girl who looks shocked. A woman with a face like a trout peeps from the edge of the spray, and in the far background of the photograph, a group of men and women are gathered on the steps outside a house. Only by walking into the photograph, going beyond the rim and up very close, can you make out their faces. They are Irish immigrants. Their clothes and expressions tell you that. Flat hats and grey trousers held up with suspenders. Some of them are sharing cigarettes, laughing, breaking out to melodeon, peeling labels off of bottles that come from jacket pockets. They are fetching Galway and Dublin and Leitrim and Donegal from the bottom end of these bottles. And toasts are being made or have been made. A toast to new arrivals who come hugging their suitcases with Ashwood Hurleys strapped on the side. A toast to strange billboards that flash out new neon signs over the Bronx. A toast to a boxer who puts away journeymen heavyweights. A toast to the fire hydrant and the leaping boy. And maybe a toast to the big grey figure of Eisenhower, who will soon put a big chunk of metal up high in the air.
Yeah, that's really nice. That's really nice. I think I was at that scene. There's another passage in that book on on your use of the word Songdogs in the title, and maybe you could read that.
Sure, I'd
that's
be delighted
a shorter one.
This is basically explaining the title of the book. Songdogs is a coyote and an old Native American mythology they held in the universe at their feet. And the narrator is talking about his parents. Years later, in America, I was told that Navajo Indians believed coyotes ushered in the big bang of the world with their song, stood on the rim of nothingness before time, shoved their pointed muzzles in the air, and howled the world into existence at their feet. The Indians called them Songdogs. The universe was etched with their howls, sound merging into sound, the beginning of all songs. Long ago, when they told me their stories about Mexico, Mum and Dad, I believed they were true. And I suppose I still do. They were my Songdogs. My mother by the washing line, my father flailing his way against the current. They tried very hard to tell me how much they'd been in love with one another, how good life had been, that coyotes really did exist and sing in the universe of themselves on their wedding day. And maybe they did. Maybe there was a tremendous howl that reached its way across the desert. But the past is a place that is full of energy and imagination. In remembering, we distill the memory down. We manage our universe by stuffing it into the original quark, the point of burstingness. It's the lethargy of the present that terrifies us all. The slowness, the mundanity, the sheer plod of each day. Like my endless hours strolling through Mexico, and my father's constant casting these days, his own little Songdog's noise of a fishing line whisking its way through the air.
That's really nice. You know, I think anyone reading that book is going to make the I'm sure, false assumption that there's a lot of autobiographical material in terms of the character, the young character and his family. So, you know, on behalf of your readers, I have to ask you if your mother is Mexican.
Right. Well, people come up to Mum, and she's from Derry, right? She's from the heart of Derry, County Derry. From a farm in Derry. So, Sally, I never knew you were Mexican, you know? Sally, does Sean, your husband, really take pictures of you like that in the bath, you know? Because the photographer takes pictures of the Mexican mother. But no, you see, I am interested, I don't want to write about my family. I don't want to write about myself all that much, even though ultimately,
sure,
by writing, you can only write about yourself. But I don't want to hurt my father, my mother. I don't want to talk about my friends. And besides, I think it's much more liberating to be in the imagination. People always tell you, write about what you know about. And I say, no, write about what you don't know about. Because then you go into a place of the imagination. And ultimately, you can only write about what you know about that because the words come out of you.
Exactly.
But if you free yourself up by saying, I'm going to write about things that I don't really know of.
On the other hand, with the new book, This Side of Brightness, which obviously involves a lot of information and a lot of knowledge of the sand hogs and the people who built the subway tunnels in New York. You may not have known a lot about it at first, but you've certainly learned a lot about it. And I think, again, people reading the book would be really interested in knowing exactly what you did. Did you hang out with moles, with people who lived underground? Did you spend a lot of time down there?
I did.
What was that like for you personally?
It was amazing. I mean, I was at a party one night and met this sociologist who said there are people living underground, you know, and I was stunned by the notion that I was walking above these people's lives without knowing about it whatsoever. So I went down to Riverside Park and started hanging out around a tunnel. Made friends with some of the fellas who are
by
down
tunnel,
there.
you mean by a subway entrance? Or,
This was actually a railway tunnel. And they sort of took me in and said, leave the white fella alone, you know, leave the Irish kid alone, to everyone who was walking along. And I got, excuse me, I got to know them quite well and became friends. And I spent about a year down there, almost every day, down in the tunnels with these people. And the various different tunnels, the crack tunnels, where it's very dangerous. The steam tunnels, where it looks like Dante's Inferno. And the Riverside Park tunnel, which is not so bad.
It's interesting that they accepted you into this fairly small microcosm. How did you?
I think I was very lucky, because I think it's about listening, and I think there's a huge dignity in listening to people, because often, I used to look at a homeless man and locate that homeless man purely in that moment that he is homeless. And that he looks a bit bedraggled and maybe he doesn't have any money. But then when I started to get to know these people, they tell me about their mothers, their fathers, their history, their background, and you can see the full flesh. And just by listening to people, and I think the big problem with this homeless population is not really food or clothing or things like that. It's dignity.
Yeah,
It really is
yeah.
dignity. And I think they were surprised that somebody would listen to them, and then they'd listen to me. And also, I mean, they helped me out. They knew I was writing, and I helped them out. I'd bring down candles or food, or you know, if there was a certain problem.
There wasn't any resentment of you as someone coming from the sort of topside world?
Sure. Well, what's interesting is that being Irish helped a huge amount, because there's a currency to being Irish. A lot of these fellas are have been sort of oppressed by society, and rightly or wrongly, they identified in me as being Irish a history of oppression. So that I could somehow understand that I wasn't American or white or American, whatever it happens to be, you know, coming in and examining their world.
Yeah.
It was more that I was coming from the outside.
From the outside, yeah. Do you keep in touch with any of the people
Sure,
you met?
yeah.
Have any of them read the book?
Not yet. They've read the articles. The book has only just come out in proof form, and then came out, and it's just really hit the shelves now. So I'm going to give all copies to everyone without a doubt.
great.
I hope they enjoy it.
Yeah.
You know?
Could you maybe read something from the book?
Sure, I'd be delighted to. I'll try and give you a little bit of impression of what the tunnels are like nowadays in the contemporary, because the book is also about the building of the tunnels. And this is Tree Frog, my hero, watching Angela as she comes down the tunnel. This is her first time in the tunnel. She steps from a shaft of blue light into long darkness, and into light again, and into an even further darkness, where all he can see is the outline of her figure as she moves, hugged into her coat. The tunnel is like a doubtful church, letting in light at strategic points and leaving the rest in blackness. He slithers along behind her on the same side of the tracks, and she walks in the hard-packed dirt. Her high heels leave tracks. Tree Frog wipes his hand across a runny nose and then lifts his head at the sound of a noise. 2 pinpoints of light appear in the distance, the upstate train. He darts a look at the woman ahead of him. She has her head down as she walks. His heart jumps. The sound of the train grows louder, and suddenly his throat feels dry. "Don't," he whispers, "don't." She lifts her head and stares long and hard as the headlights bear down. She moves nearer to the tracks. The train horn blasts loud, and sparks flare from the underside of the carriage, and the noise is deafening, and he thinks she's going to stand in front of the train, to clutch it to her chest like a massive bullet, and he shouts, "Don't!" But the shout is drowned by the howl of the engine. He covers his eyes, and when he looks again, she's simply standing by the track, staring at the windows, letting the Amtrak rifle past. He sits on the ground and puts his hand to his heart and closes his eyes and says aloud to nobody, "Thank you, thank you." And then he watches as she steps through the orchard of garbage outside the cubicle where Dean the trash man lives. Light spills in behind her, and she goes tiptoeing past the mounds of human feces, and the torn magazines, and the empty containers, and the hypodermic needles with blobs of blood at their tips like poppies erupting in a field. In her black high heels, she moves like a dark, long-legged bird, past the broken bottles and rat droppings, and a baby carriage, and smashed TVs, and squashed cans, and discarded cardboard boxes, and shattered jars, and orange peels, and crack vials, and a single teddy bear with both its eyes missing, its belly nibbled into by rats. And she keeps on going among all the leftovers of human ruin.
Oh, that's great. I noticed when I was looking through your 3 books earlier today that the first sentence of each of them centers on water. And obviously, you know, you write with a real sense of language and with a real focus on the metaphorical realities of what you're dealing with. And I was wondering how deliberate and conscious those kinds of strategies were for you as a writer.
I don't know how deliberate and conscious the act of writing really is until afterwards, until you finish the book and you begin to examine it. I have used water as a metaphor all the time, and you know, Songdogs is about a man fishing in a river. Fishing the Slope-like
Yes,
River is
right,
about
sure.
mothers fishing for sons.
Yeah.
And this side of Brightness has a scene in it where men explode from a river
Right.
when they're building an underground tunnel. I don't know what it is. If I knew what it was, perhaps I'd lose it. But I choose not to examine it quite so much.
Yeah, sure. Well, that makes sense. Along those same kinds of lines, with both Songdogs and This Side of Brightness, you have two parallel narratives going on, and in This Side of Brightness, they both converge in both books.
Mm-hmm.
But in the new book, they converge in a really wonderful and clever way. That's not quite the right word because it's more than clever. And I wondered why you choose that way of telling the story. And
That's very interesting. I think there's the past and the present is the double helix of life. I think we're inextricably bound in our present by all the moments that have gone before. That whatever we are now is whatever we have been, or wherever we are now is wherever we have been.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm interested in the notion of the present tense being constantly defined by everything that has happened to us, so that the moment that we are living here now is not isolated, but it's informed by all the other moments that we've had. And so I like that double helix structure of storytelling.
yeah, it's very effective. It's wonderful. Well, unfortunately, we're almost out of time. It's been great having you on the show and great talking with you. And
A real pleasure, thank you.
yeah, and maybe if there's something brief from the new book that we could finish out with, that would be terrific.
Sure, I'd be delighted to. This would be, Tree Frog is a cartographer, and he makes maps of people's faces. And this is where later, when he gets to know Angela, he makes a map of her face. He works with great care, making sure the lines are consistent, uniform, unwavering, that a gentle curve appears between dots, that the graph doesn't become jittery or messy. He never once uses the eraser. The lighter and the pencil are switched from hand to hand, his fingers shaking in the cold. Angela looks over his shoulder, chin on his overcoat, saying, "This is about the stupidest thing I ever seen." But when Tree Frog is finished, he holds up the paper and shows Angela the rise and curl of her face, the canyons and ridges and riverbeds and hanging valleys that she has become. "Hey-o," he says to the paper. "That's me. There's your ears, there's your nose, that's your cheek. It looks bumpy. Do me a favor, Treefy," she says. "Yeah? Get rid of the bruise there," she says. And he looks at her and smiles, scraping his fingernails along the top of the eraser to make sure it doesn't leave black smudges on the graph paper. He scrubs out the hillock where the bruise was. And she kisses him on the cheek and softly says, "Dr. Tree Frog."
Colum, thanks for joining us today.
Listen, thanks very much. It was a real pleasure and an honor.
And thank you for being with us on The Writing Life.